At my dad's retirement party, my mother mocked me in front of 70 guests. She never has a real career. I smiled in silence. But then, my dad's boss stood up, looked at her in shock, and revealed who I actually am. The whole room instantly froze. Then she started to panic. Before I tell you what happened, welcome back to Van's Rock Stories. If you've ever had family members decide who you are without really knowing your story, this one might feel familiar. And if you've ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your experience. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life family stories. Now let me tell you what happened. My name is Natalie Hayes. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, my family treated me like the daughter who never quite figured things out. Not a failure. Just someone whose life never seemed to make sense to them. The funny part is that nobody ever really asked what I did. They made assumptions, repeated them often enough, and eventually started believing them. The day everything finally came to a head was my father's retirement party. My dad, Richard Hayes, had spent 37 years working at the same manufacturing facility. The company helped organize a large celebration at a community hall in Springfield. Family members came from out of town. Former co-workers brought their spouses. Neighbors showed up. By the time the event started, there were around 70 people there. I arrived alone. That wasn't unusual. As soon as I walked inside, I spotted my mother moving through the room, making sure everything looked perfect. She loved being in control of family events. "Natalie," she said when she saw me. She gave me a quick hug. "I'm glad you made it. Wouldn't miss Dad's retirement." "Good." Then another guest arrived, and her attention immediately shifted. Some things never changed. A few minutes later, I found my dad talking with former coworkers. The moment he saw me, he smiled. "There she is." He pulled me into a hug. My father and I had our disagreements over the years, but we'd always managed to stay on decent terms. "How are you doing?" I asked. He laughed. "Ask me tomorrow." One of his coworkers grinned. "Richard's been talking about retirement for years. Now he's scared of it." Dad pointed at him. "That's because I still don't know what retired people do all day." Everyone laughed. For a little while, things felt normal. Then my cousin Ashley joined us. After a few minutes of conversation, she mentioned her husband's latest promotion. I congratulated her. Then came the question I had heard countless times. "What about you? Are you still doing business?" "Yeah," I said. "Oh, right." And just like that, the conversation moved on. That happened all the time. For more than 10 years, my family kept asking what I did, but never seemed interested in the answer. At first, I tried explaining. I talked about logistics, distribution, contracts, and operations. Most people lost interest before I finished the second sentence. Eventually, I stopped trying. It was easier. Over the next hour, I talked with relatives, neighbors, and old family friends. Most of them knew my father well. Very few knew much about me. Honestly, I didn't mind. I was there for my dad, not to discuss work. As the evening continued, my mother took charge of the program. She stood near the microphone, checking notes and organizing speakers. I also noticed something I'd seen many times before. Whenever she introduced family members, she highlighted their accomplishments. A cousin who became a lawyer, a nephew who earned a scholarship, someone else's promotion. Every introduction came with a success story, except mine. Whenever she mentioned me, she kept things vague. I was used to it. Later, everyone gathered near the front of the hall for the speeches. My mother stepped behind the microphone. The room slowly quieted. She thanked everyone for coming and spoke warmly about my father's career. People smiled. Some laughed at her stories. The mood was relaxed. Then she began introducing family members sitting in the audience, one by one. Eventually, she looked toward me. "Natalie's here too, of course." Several guests turned in my direction. My mother smiled into the microphone. And Natalie is still busy with all her mysterious projects. A few people laughed. A few nodded. I gave the same polite smile I'd been giving for years. And normally, that would have been the end of it. But this time, someone else in the room was paying very close attention. The thing that always bothered me wasn't that my family disagreed with my decisions. It was how quickly they decided I hadn't thought them through. That started when I was 23. I was only a few months away from graduating college. On paper, my life looked completely normal. I attended classes, I worked part-time, I was heading toward a safe career. Everyone around me seemed relieved that I was following a predictable path. The problem was that I wasn't excited about any of it. For almost a year, I'd been spending more time studying transportation routes and distribution systems than I was studying for my actual classes. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. I'd started noticing small businesses struggling with shipping and inventory issues. The more I looked into it, the more opportunities I saw. At first, it was just an idea. Then it became a plan. Then it became something I couldn't stop thinking about. I remember sitting in a coffee shop one afternoon with a notebook full of numbers. A local supplier had agreed to meet with me. Nothing formal. Just a conversation. The owner listened while I explained how I thought I could improve his distribution process. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "You're still in college, right?" "Technically." He laughed. "That's not exactly a yes." "No, it's not." He looked over my notes for a moment. Then he said something that stayed with me. "If you ever get this thing off the ground, give me a call." That wasn't a contract, but it was enough to tell me I wasn't imagining the opportunity. Over the next few months, I spoke with more business owners. Some ignored me. Some politely brushed me off. A few listened. One introduced me to another company, then another. By the time graduation was approaching, I had something most people didn't know about. Potential customers. Not guaranteed customers, but real companies willing to talk business. The more momentum I gained, the harder it became to focus on classes. Eventually, I made a decision, one that sounded completely insane to everyone else. I was going to leave school and build the business full-time. The announcement did not go well. I still remember that dinner. My father was halfway through his meal when I told them. The room went quiet. "You're what?" my mother asked. "I'm leaving school." She stared at me. "For a semester?" "No." Dad sat back in his chair. "Okay," he said carefully. "Explain." At least he was willing to listen. So I did. I told them about the companies I'd been meeting, the business plan, the conversations I'd already had. I explained everything. My father listened. My mother didn't. "You want to throw away 4 years of college for this?" "I'm not throwing it away." "That's exactly what you're doing." Dad rubbed his forehead. "Natalie, how much money do you actually have?" "Not enough yet." "Then how are you planning to start?" "I'll apply for a business loan." That answer made things worse. My mother laughed. Not because she thought I was funny. The other kind. "A bank is going to hand money to a 23-year-old college dropout?" "I've already started talking to lenders." "You can't be serious." "I am serious." The discussion dragged on for nearly 2 hours. Every answer I gave created more questions. Every explanation sounded like proof that I was making a mistake. By the end of dinner, nobody was yelling. That almost made it worse. My father looked worried. My mother looked disappointed. And both of them looked convinced I'd lost my mind. A few days later, my aunt called. Then my cousin. Apparently, the news had spread through the family faster than I expected. Everyone had an opinion. Almost none of them were positive. For the first time in my life, people looked at me differently. Not as ambitious, as reckless. The hardest part wasn't the criticism. It was realizing nobody believed I had a plan. They thought I woke up one morning and made an emotional decision. They had no idea how many months I'd spent preparing. So I stopped defending myself. I submitted the paperwork. met with lenders, answered questions, waited, and waited. Then one Tuesday morning, my phone rang. The number belonged to the bank. I stepped outside before answering. The loan officer sounded calm, professional. Ms. Hayes? Yes. We've completed our review. I tightened my grip on the phone. Then she said 5 words that made me stop walking. Your application has been approved. I must have asked the loan officer to repeat herself 3 times, not because the connection was bad, because I couldn't believe it. When the call ended, I just stood there staring at my phone. For weeks, everyone had been telling me why this wouldn't work. The bank had just told me otherwise. The loan wasn't huge, $12,000, but to me, it felt enormous. It was enough to get started. A month later, I signed a lease on a small warehouse on the edge of town. Calling it a warehouse almost sounds generous. It was old. Half the lighting barely worked. The office was basically a desk shoved into a corner. But it was mine. I remember standing inside the empty building with the keys in my hand. No employees, no customers, no guarantee of success, just possibility. The first few weeks were exciting. I spent mornings meeting clients, afternoons coordinating shipments, evenings doing paperwork. Most nights ended with me sitting alone trying to figure out cash flow. I quickly learned that owning a business sounded much more glamorous than it actually was. One morning, I was loading inventory. That same night, I was teaching myself accounting software. Some days, I felt like a business owner. Other days, I felt like a delivery driver who happened to answer emails. Still, things were moving. Slowly. But they were moving. A few of those companies I'd spoken to before leaving college actually gave me a chance. Small contracts. Nothing life-changing. But enough to keep the doors open. For a while, that was enough. Then reality showed up. Deliveries got delayed. Equipment broke. Customers changed plans. Problems appeared faster than solutions. Every week seemed to introduce a new expense. The money disappeared much faster than I expected. I started paying attention to every dollar, every invoice, every late payment, especially late payments. One evening, I drove to my parents' house for dinner. I was exhausted. Dad noticed immediately. You look like you haven't slept. I've slept. He raised an eyebrow. Recently? I laughed. Fair point. For a few minutes, the conversation was normal. Then my mother asked the question she'd been asking for months. So when are you going to start looking for a real job? There it was. Again, I put down my fork. I have a real job. You know what I mean. No, actually I don't. She sighed. Natalie, businesses fail all the time. Some do. Most do. Dad didn't say much, but I could tell he was worried too. The difference was that he asked questions. Mom made conclusions. As I was leaving, Dad followed me outside. You okay? He asked quietly. Yeah. You don't sound convinced. I looked toward my truck. I'm figuring things out. He nodded. Then he said something that stayed with me. I hope you're right. Not, I know you'll succeed. Not, I'm proud of you. Just, I hope you're right. By the 4th month, I understood exactly why most businesses fail. The workload never stopped. The pressure never stopped. And every problem felt personal because there was nobody else to blame. Then came the biggest issue yet. One of my largest customers fell behind on payments. At first, I wasn't worried. Late payments happen. Everybody told me that. A week passed. Then 2. Then 3. The invoice kept sitting there unpaid. That customer represented a huge portion of my monthly revenue. Suddenly, the numbers stopped working. I spent nights staring at spreadsheets, recalculating, trying to buy time. The situation became impossible to ignore. If that payment didn't arrive soon, I was in serious trouble. I cut costs everywhere I could, skipped paying myself, delayed purchases, worked even longer hours. Still, The account balance kept shrinking. One afternoon, I sat alone in the warehouse office looking at my remaining cash. The number was so low I checked it twice, then a third time. For the first time since starting the business, I seriously wondered whether everyone had been right. Maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe my mother would eventually get to say, "I told you so." The thought made me angry enough to keep working. A few minutes later, my phone rang. I almost ignored it. The number wasn't familiar. No company name, no contact saved. Just a number. I answered anyway. "Hello." A man's voice came through the line. "Hi, am I speaking with Natalie Hayes?" "Yes." "This is David Mercer. I was given your name by one of our suppliers." I sat up a little straighter. Then he said the name of a company much larger than any client I'd worked with before. And suddenly, I wasn't thinking about my bank balance anymore. The company David Mercer worked for was bigger than anything I'd dealt with before. Not massive, but big enough that winning the account would completely change my business. The first meeting happened in a conference room that felt far more professional than my tiny warehouse office. I remember showing up early, checking my notes, then checking them again. David walked in carrying a folder and introduced me to two other managers. For nearly an hour, they asked questions. A lot of questions. About delivery schedules, capacity, growth plans, contingency plans. At one point, one of them looked at me and asked, "Can your company actually handle this volume?" It wasn't rude, it was a fair question. At the time, I wasn't even sure I knew the answer, but I looked him straight in the eye. "Not today," I said, "but I know exactly what needs to happen to get there." The room went quiet for a second. Then David nodded, and somehow, that answer worked. A few weeks later, they gave me the contract. I still remember sitting in my office staring at the paperwork. Not because I was celebrating, because I was panicking. The contract was big enough to save the company. It was also big enough to overwhelm it. For the next several months, my entire life revolved around making sure we didn't fail. I hired my first employee, then another. Suddenly, I wasn't doing everything myself anymore. That adjustment was harder than I expected. I was used to solving every problem personally. Now I had to trust other people. One afternoon, I caught myself rechecking work that had already been completed. My new employee finally laughed. "You know you're allowed to go home sometimes, right?" "I'll think about it." "You always say that." She wasn't wrong, but for the first time, things were working. The company that had nearly run out of money was generating consistent revenue. Invoices were getting paid. Customers were renewing contracts. I even started paying myself regularly. Nothing extravagant. Just enough to finally breathe. Dad noticed the difference first. One Sunday afternoon, he stopped by the warehouse. He looked around at the staff moving inventory and loading shipments. "This is bigger than I expected," he admitted. I smiled. "I've been trying to tell people that." He laughed. "Fair enough." For a moment, I thought things might be changing, not dramatically, just a little. Maybe people were finally starting to see what I'd been building. That hope lasted until the next family gathering. It was a birthday dinner for one of my cousins. Nothing formal. Just relatives packed around a few tables at a local restaurant. At one point, my aunt asked what everyone had been up to. The conversation moved around the table. People talked about vacations, kids, jobs. When it reached me, I decided to actually share something. A small part of me thought maybe this time would be different. "We've been growing pretty quickly," I said. "I recently hired a couple of employees." "Oh," my aunt replied. "That's nice." For a second, I waited for a follow-up question. There wasn't one. Instead, my cousin Ashley leaned forward. "Speaking of work, Ethan just got promoted again." The entire table immediately turned toward her. Questions started flying. "What position? Does that mean another raise? Are you moving?" For the next 10 minutes, everyone discussed Ethan's promotion. Nobody returned to my topic. Not one person. Eventually, I just sat back and listened. At first, I felt annoyed, then embarrassed for expecting anything different. Then something else happened. The disappointment started fading, not because they suddenly understood me, because I finally realized they probably never would. And maybe that was okay. The strange thing was that the realization felt lighter than I expected. I didn't need everyone at that table to approve of my choices. I already had customers, employees, contracts, results. The drive home was quiet. Streetlights passed across the windshield as I replayed the evening in my head. Not angrily, just honestly. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to explain my business, trying to make relatives understand, trying to earn recognition that never seemed to arrive. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody else even knew it happened. I grabbed my keys, shut off the engine, and sat there for a moment. From now on, family dinners would be about family. If somebody asked about my business, I'd answer. But I wasn't going to bring it up anymore. I wasn't going to pitch my life to people who had already stopped listening. The decision to stop explaining my business to family members turned out to be one of the easiest promises I'd ever kept. Mostly because nobody asked many questions anyway. Years started moving faster after that. The company grew. Then it grew again. What had once been a tiny warehouse with a folding table slowly became something much bigger. We added new clients, expanded into neighboring states, leased additional warehouse space, hired more employees. At some point, I stopped counting how many hours I worked each week. There simply weren't enough hours. One month, I was negotiating contracts in Missouri. The next, I was visiting customers in Kansas, then Arkansas, then Oklahoma. My calendar became a collection of flights, meetings, phone calls, and hotel reservations. It was exhausting, but it was the kind of exhaustion that came from progress. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely confident in what I was building. Not hopeful, not optimistic. Confident. The business wasn't surviving anymore. It was succeeding. One afternoon, I was reviewing quarterly numbers with my operations manager. She slid a report across the table. "You know this is kind of ridiculous, right?" I looked down. "What is?" "The growth." I laughed. "We're not allowed to say that out loud." "Why?" "Because the universe hears things." She shook her head. "I'm serious. 5 years ago, this company was basically you in a forklift. That's an exaggeration. A small exaggeration. Moments like that felt good. Not because of the money, because they reminded me how far we'd come. The strange part was that almost none of it changed how my family viewed me. At family gatherings, conversations still sounded exactly the same. "What have you been up to?" "Work." "Oh." Then someone would immediately change the subject. Over time, the lack of curiosity became almost funny. At one barbecue, an uncle asked whether I was still renting storage units. Storage units? I ran a regional distribution network. I nearly choked on my drink. Instead of correcting him, I just smiled. Something like that. Another relative once asked if my business was finally making enough money to pay the bills. Finally. As if I had been barely hanging on for years. The truth was that I had stopped correcting people. It required too much energy. And honestly, they weren't trying to be cruel. Most of them simply had no idea what I did. The problem was that when people don't have information, they create their own version of the story. My family had created theirs. In their version, I owned a small company that somehow stayed afloat. Nothing more, nothing less. And because I never talked about revenue, contracts, acquisitions, or growth, that version remained unchallenged. Family dinners became easier once I accepted that. We talked about holidays, sports, kids, vacation plans, safe topics. The arguments disappeared. So did most meaningful conversations. The relationships weren't bad, just shallow, polite, predictable. I still visited my parents regularly. Dad always asked how work was going, but usually in a general way. Mom had mostly stopped criticizing my decisions, which sounded like progress, until I realized she had simply stopped paying attention. One evening, while helping Dad fix a fence in his backyard, he casually asked, "You still traveling a lot?" "More than I'd like." He nodded. "Must mean business is okay." I smiled. "Something like that." He didn't ask anything else, and I didn't volunteer anything. That had become our routine. Comfortable, a little sad, but comfortable. Back at the office, things continued moving forward. We weren't just handling distribution anymore. We were helping companies redesign parts of their supply chains, managing larger contracts, building relationships with businesses I never would have imagined talking to when I was 23. Then one Tuesday afternoon, my assistant knocked on my office door. "You have a call." "Who is it?" She glanced at her notes. "A private investment group." That immediately got my attention. I picked up the call expecting a quick conversation. Instead, it lasted nearly an hour. The man on the other end had been following our growth for some time. He knew our numbers, our expansion plans, even some of our recent contracts. By the end of the conversation, I was sitting forward in my chair, because what he was proposing wasn't another client, it wasn't another partnership, it was something much bigger. When the call ended, I looked at the business card information he had emailed over. Then I looked around my office. The company I had built was suddenly standing at the edge of an opportunity larger than anything I'd ever handled before. The first investor meeting nearly convinced me I had no idea what I was doing. I walked into a conference room full of people who had been buying, selling, and building companies longer than I'd been running mine. Some had decades of experience. Some managed portfolios worth more money than I could imagine when I first started my business. I spent the first 20 minutes wondering if someone had invited the wrong person. One of the investors eventually noticed. "You've gone quiet." I laughed. "I'm trying not to sound like the least experienced person in the room." A few people smiled. Then an older investor shrugged. "You probably are?" The room laughed. Even I laughed. Then he pointed at me. "But you're also the only one here who's spent years actually running logistics operations every day." That changed something. For the first time, I stopped focusing on what I didn't know and started paying attention to what I did know. The partnership moved forward. Not because I became an investment expert, because I brought a perspective the group needed. I understood warehouses, transportation networks, supply chains, the things that happened after deals were signed. Over the next couple of years, I found myself thinking less about growth and more about acquisitions. At first, I hated the idea. Buying companies sounded intimidating, complicated, expensive. Then I learned something important. Most acquisitions weren't about buying perfection, they were about recognizing value that other people couldn't see. Some businesses had good customers but poor management. Others had strong infrastructure but cash flow problems. The learning curve was brutal. I made mistakes. Real mistakes. One early project looked promising on paper. The numbers seemed solid. The forecasts looked reasonable. 6 months later, the entire thing fell apart. The market shifted. Costs increased. Several assumptions turned out to be wrong. I lost money. A painful amount of money. I remember staring at the final report in my office. One of my partners called. "You okay?" "Not particularly." "Good." I laughed. "What kind of answer is that?" "The kind that means you're taking it seriously." Nobody acted like failure was the end of the world. They treated it as tuition. Expensive tuition. But tuition nonetheless. The difference between those investors and many people I'd known growing up was interesting. My family saw mistakes as proof that a decision had been wrong. The investors saw mistakes as part of the process. If something failed, the first question wasn't who to blame, it was what to learn. Over time, that mindset changed me. I became more comfortable taking calculated risks, more comfortable making decisions without knowing every answer. The strangest part was how much trust I started receiving from people who barely knew me. One investor introduced me to another. That person introduced me to a third. Opportunities multiplied. My professional network started growing faster than my social one. Sometimes I would attend meetings where people immediately assumed I was competent, not because of my family, because of my track record. That feeling never stopped being a little strange, especially when family gatherings still felt exactly the same. At Thanksgiving one year, a relative asked whether I was still working on that shipping business. I smiled and said yes. Then the conversation moved on. Earlier that week, I'd spent hours discussing acquisition strategy with investors overseeing hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. The contrast was almost funny. Almost. A few months later, our investment group gathered for what looked like a routine meeting. Then, the presentation started. Financial reports appeared on the screen. Revenue charts, debt figures, operational data. The room grew noticeably more focused. One of the senior partners pointed toward a company profile displayed behind him. "This is the opportunity we've been evaluating." Several people leaned forward, including me. The company wasn't small. It was a major industrial group with facilities spread across multiple locations. For years it had been successful. Now it was struggling. Leadership problems, operational inefficiencies, financial pressure. The partner clicked to the next slide. "We believe this business can be turned around." The room fell quiet. Then someone asked the obvious question, "Are we actually considering acquiring it?" The partner smiled. "That's exactly what we're considering." I looked back at the screen, at the company profile, at the list of facilities, and realized this wasn't another small project. This was the largest opportunity I'd ever seen sitting in front of me. The acquisition process took almost a year. When people hear the word acquisition, they usually imagine a single meeting and a signed contract. Reality looks nothing like that. There were negotiations, audits, legal reviews, financial reviews, then more negotiations. Entire weeks would disappear into conference calls. Months passed before anything became official. More than once, I thought the deal would fall apart. At one point, one of the major investors walked out of a meeting halfway through a discussion. Another time, attorneys spent 3 weeks arguing over a section of paperwork most people would never read. Nothing about it felt dramatic, just exhausting. But eventually, the pieces started coming together. And one afternoon, sitting in a conference room surrounded by people far smarter than me, I heard the words everyone had been waiting for. The acquisition was approved. Nobody cheered. Nobody jumped out of their seats. That surprised me. Years earlier, I would have expected some huge celebration. Instead, people simply nodded and started discussing implementation plans. The work wasn't over. The real work was just beginning. Still, when I drove home that evening, I allowed myself a rare moment of pride. Not because I had done it alone. I hadn't. But because I remembered standing in that tiny warehouse years earlier, wondering whether I could survive another month. Now I was helping oversee companies spread across multiple states. The contrast felt unreal. Life changed gradually after that. My schedule became even busier. More meetings, more travel, more responsibility. The funny thing was that almost none of my daily habits changed. I still arrived early. Still preferred practical hotels over expensive ones. Still checked operational reports myself. One of my colleagues once laughed when he saw me reviewing warehouse performance data. "You know, you don't have to do that personally anymore." "Probably. Then why are you doing it?" Because I like knowing what's actually happening. He shook his head. You still think like an operator. Maybe he was right. Part of me never stopped being the 23-year-old loading inventory into a truck. As the group expanded, I started spending more time reviewing reports from different subsidiaries. Some were familiar, others weren't. One afternoon, I was working through a stack of operational summaries when a facility name caught my attention. I knew that name. I looked again. Then a third time. The facility belonged to the manufacturing group we had recently brought into the larger organization, the same manufacturing group my father had worked for nearly his entire career. I leaned back in my chair. For a moment, I just stared at the report. The connection had never been part of my decision-making. The acquisition team had evaluated dozens of facilities, hundreds of pages of data. But now that the deal was complete, the reality felt strangely personal. My father's workplace was now part of a company structure connected to our investment group. Connected to me. The thought was oddly surreal. The first question people usually ask when they hear this part of the story is simple. Why didn't I tell him? The answer is also simple. Because I didn't think he'd believe me. Not really. Imagine sitting down at a family dinner and casually saying, "By the way, the company that owns your facility is now part of a group I'm invested in." I could practically hear the silence that would follow, then the confusion, then the skepticism, maybe even the uncomfortable laughter. No matter how true it was, it sounded ridiculous. So I kept it to myself. Not out of secrecy. Not out of embarrassment. Mostly because I didn't see any reason to create another awkward conversation. Nothing about my father's job changed. His supervisors remained the same. His responsibilities remained the same. Life continued normally. Months passed. Then more months. Occasionally, I would review reports connected to that facility. Safety metrics, production numbers, operational updates, routine information. Then one afternoon, while scanning a personnel report, I noticed something unexpected. A familiar name. I stopped scrolling, looked closer. There it was. Richard Hayes, my father, listed among long-term employees recognized for years of service. I sat quietly for a moment. Not because the information was surprising, because seeing his name there made everything feel real in a way spreadsheets never had. For the first time, the worlds I had spent years keeping separate were sitting on the same page. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my phone buzzed. The screen showed my mother's name. That alone was unusual. My mother and I talked regularly enough, but she rarely called in the middle of a workday unless she needed something specific. I answered. "Hey, Mom." "Natalie, good. I caught you." That sounded about right. Not hello. Not how are you. Straight to business. "What's up?" "We finalized the retirement party." I leaned back in my chair. Dad's retirement had been getting closer for months. Every family conversation seemed to include some update about it. The guest list, the venue, the catering, the decorations. At times it felt like my father was retiring from the company, and my mother was planning a presidential inauguration. "When is it again?" I asked. She sounded mildly offended. "Next Saturday." "Right. You are coming, aren't you?" There was a brief pause, not because I was debating, because I knew why she was asking. I had missed a few family events over the years due to work. Enough that people occasionally joked about needing to schedule appointments to see me. "Yes," I said. "I'll be there." "Good." Her tone softened slightly. "This is important to your father." That part I already knew. The conversation continued for several more minutes, most of it focused on logistics, arrival times, parking, guest count. Then Mom casually started listing people who would be attending. Former coworkers, neighbors, extended relatives, church friends. The list kept going. By the time she finished, it sounded like half the county would be there. When the call ended, I looked down at my calendar. Saturday was packed, but there was never any chance I was missing it. Whatever disagreements my father and I had experienced over the years, 37 years at one company was an achievement. He deserved to be celebrated. A few days later, Dad called. That surprised me even more. He wasn't much of a phone person. Most of our conversations happened face to face. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. Then he hesitated. That wasn't like him. "You coming Saturday?" I smiled. "I already told Mom yes." "I know." Another pause. Then he cleared his throat. "Good." That one word carried more weight than he probably intended. For a moment, neither of us said much. Then he laughed quietly. "Your mother has been planning this thing for months." I gathered that. "You should see the number of lists she has." I believe it. He laughed again. The conversation stayed simple. Sports, retirement plans, a few jokes about how he still wasn't sure what retired people actually did all day. Nothing emotional, nothing dramatic. But before hanging up, he said something that stuck with me. "I'm glad you're coming." Just that. Simple. Honest. For most of my adult life, my relationship with Dad had existed in that space. Not distant, not especially close. We cared about each other. We just weren't great at saying it out loud. The closer the event got, the more curious I became. Partly because of Dad, partly because I hadn't attended a large family gathering in quite a while, and partly because I knew exactly how these events usually worked. People would ask vague questions about work. I'd give vague answers. Everyone would move on. No drama, no conflict, just another family function. Saturday arrived faster than expected. I drove to the community hall a little earlier than planned. Cars already filled most of the parking lot. Through the front windows, I could see people moving around inside. The event was clearly underway. I parked, grabbed my jacket, and headed toward the entrance. The moment I stepped inside, I immediately recognized my mother's influence. Everything was organized, every table arranged perfectly. Name cards, photos, decorations highlighting Dad's career. She had turned a retirement party into a full production. I smiled despite myself. Some things never changed. Guests filled the room. Relatives, neighbors, former co-workers, people I hadn't seen in years. I was still taking everything in when something unexpected caught my attention. Actually, several things. Several people. Faces I recognized, not from family gatherings, not from Springfield, from business meetings, from boardrooms, from professional events. I slowed my pace. For a second, I honestly wondered if I was mistaken. Then one of them turned slightly, and I knew exactly who he was, which raised a much bigger question. What was he doing at my father's retirement party? The man spotted me before I could pretend I hadn't seen him. "Natalie." I stopped and smiled. "Mark." He walked over with the same calm, professional demeanor I'd seen in countless meetings. The difference was that neither of us was wearing a suit. And instead of a conference room, we were standing beside a table covered in retirement party decorations. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He laughed. "I could ask you the same thing." Then he glanced toward my father. "Richard Hayes is your dad?" "Yeah." His eyebrows lifted. I had no idea. That made two of us. I hadn't known he would be attending either. Mark Sullivan was the operational director of the facility where my father worked. Over the years, we'd sat through more strategy meetings than I could count. Budget discussions, expansion plans, operational reviews, the usual corporate marathon. We knew each other professionally. Our personal lives almost never came up. "Small world," he said. "Apparently." He looked around the room. "So this is the retirement party." "Looks like it." "Your mother organized it?" I laughed. "That obvious?" "Very." A few minutes later, another familiar face joined us. then another. People I knew through the business world, people connected to the company group, people who knew exactly what I did for a living. Each conversation felt slightly awkward, not because they were unfriendly, because they were trying to fit two different versions of my life together. The executive they knew from meetings, the daughter standing quietly at a family gathering. One of them eventually asked, "Does your family know?" I knew what he meant. I took a sip of water. "Know what?" He smiled. "Fair enough." The event continued. People mingled. Old co-workers shared stories about my father. Family members moved from table to table. The atmosphere stayed warm and relaxed. For a while, everything felt normal. Then I noticed something. Several of the business contacts I'd spoken with kept watching certain interactions. Nothing dramatic. Just observing. The first example happened near the refreshments table. One of my relatives introduced me to a guest. "This is Natalie." The guest smiled. "What do you do?" Before I could answer, my mother appeared beside us. "Oh, Natalie is always working on some project or another." She laughed lightly. The guest laughed too. The conversation moved on. To everyone else, it probably sounded harmless. To me, it sounded familiar. To the people from my professional world, it sounded confusing. I could practically see the questions forming in their heads. A little later, I was speaking with Mark again when my cousin Ashley walked over. "Natalie," she said, "Mom told me you've been traveling a lot lately." "A little." "Still doing business stuff?" "Mostly." Ashley nodded politely. Then she immediately turned toward someone else and started discussing her husband's latest promotion. Mark waited until she walked away. Then he looked at me. "Business stuff?" I laughed despite myself. "Don't start." His expression said he finally understood. Not everything, but enough. The evening moved toward the official speeches. Guests gradually found their seats. The room grew quieter. My father sat near the front looking proud and uncomfortable. Several company representatives occupied a nearby table, including Mark. I ended up seated with family, exactly where my mother wanted me. She was moving around the room making final adjustments, checking notes, talking to speakers, straightening things that didn't need straightening. The closer she got to the microphone, the more obvious it became that she had rehearsed this moment. The room eventually settled, conversations faded, everyone focused toward the front. My mother stepped up to the podium. She looked pleased, confident, completely in control. The first part of her speech went well. She talked about Dad's career, his dedication, the sacrifices he'd made over nearly 4 decades of work. People laughed at the right moments. A few guests even wiped away tears. Then she started recognizing family members in attendance, one by one, sharing stories, mentioning accomplishments, praising milestones. The audience seemed to enjoy it. I already knew where this was heading. Then her eyes landed on me. She smiled. The familiar smile I'd seen my entire life. "Natalie's here too, of course." Several guests turned toward my table. My mother laughed softly. "And if I'm being honest, I still don't completely know what Natalie does for a living. She's always busy with one mysterious project after another." A few people chuckled. I smiled politely. Across the room, however, I noticed something different. Mark Sullivan wasn't laughing. He was staring at my mother with an expression I had never seen before. Pure confusion. Mark kept looking at my mother. Not angry, not offended, just confused. The kind of confusion that appears when someone hears information that doesn't fit reality. At first, I thought maybe he would let it go. Most people would. A small joke at a retirement party wasn't exactly worth interrupting. My mother certainly seemed to think so. She smiled at the audience. A few guests laughed politely. The moment should have passed. Instead, Mark slowly leaned forward in his chair. I noticed it immediately. So did a couple of people seated near him. My mother was still speaking. Natalie has always been independent, she said with another small laugh. She's impossible to keep track of. More scattered laughter followed. Then Mark looked from my mother to me, back to my mother, and I could practically see him trying to figure something out. The problem was that Mark wasn't hearing a harmless family joke. He was hearing a statement that made absolutely no sense. For years, we'd attended meetings together. He knew exactly what I did. He knew the projects I'd worked on. He knew the acquisitions, the strategy sessions, the board discussions, the operational reviews. To him, hearing someone say they didn't know what I did was like hearing someone claim they didn't know what a pilot did while standing inside an airplane. My father hadn't noticed any of this yet. He was focused on the speech, smiling occasionally, nodding when people applauded. The only person beginning to look uncomfortable was me, because I knew where this could go. Not exactly, but enough. A woman sitting near Mark leaned toward him and whispered something. He quietly responded. Her eyes widened. Then she looked toward me. That caught the attention of another company representative, and another. The shift was subtle, but it was happening. People were no longer listening only to my mother's speech. They were starting to watch each other, trying to understand why several company guests suddenly looked puzzled. Meanwhile, my mother continued speaking, completely unaware. She moved on to stories about relatives, promotions, degrees, scholarships, family achievements. The audience responded warmly. Everything still looked normal on the surface, but underneath, the energy in the room had changed. I could feel it. The same way you can feel a conversation taking an unexpected turn before anyone says it out loud. I glanced toward Mark again. He looked genuinely unsettled now. Not because he wanted to embarrass anyone, because he seemed convinced he was missing important information. A few seats away, one of Dad's former coworkers leaned toward him. What are they talking about? Dad shrugged. No idea. The coworker frowned. That's Natalie, right? Yeah. Huh. Not exactly a dramatic reaction, but enough to tell me people were paying attention. My mother finally paused to take a sip of water. The room settled. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Mark raised his hand slightly. Not in a formal way. More like someone politely trying to clarify something. My stomach dropped. Not because I was afraid, because I knew Mark well enough to recognize that look. Once he became confused about something, he wouldn't just ignore it. He'd ask. That was who he was. My mother noticed him. Oh, Mark. She smiled. Did you want to add something about Richard's years at the facility? Several guests turned toward him. Mark stood slowly. The room became a little quieter. Not silent, but noticeably quieter. He glanced at my father, then at my mother, then toward me. For a brief second, he looked like a man trying to decide whether he should say what he was thinking. Finally, he cleared his throat. Sorry, he said. His voice carried easily across the room. A few conversations stopped completely. Mark looked directly at my mother. Then he asked the question. Are we talking about the same Natalie Hayes? The room went quiet. My mother blinked. Excuse me? Mark looked confused. Natalie Hayes? The Natalie Hayes I've worked with for years? Several people turned toward me. My mother gave a small laugh. Well, yes. My daughter Natalie. Mark glanced around the room. I'm sorry. I thought everyone here knew. Nobody spoke. I already knew where this was going. One of Dad's coworkers finally asked, Knew what? Mark hesitated, then answered. Natalie is one of the major shareholders in the group that owns this facility. The room froze. No laughter, no whispers, nothing. My father stared at Mark, then at me, then back at Mark. What? Mark looked genuinely surprised. You didn't know? Dad didn't answer, which was answer enough. My mother slowly lowered the microphone. Natalie. Her voice sounded different. What is he talking about? I never asked him to say anything, I said. Mark immediately nodded. She didn't. My mother looked between us. You never told us any of this. I sighed. I tried for years. Nobody interrupted. I talked about the business, the contracts, the growth, the acquisitions. I shrugged. Eventually, everyone stopped listening. The words landed harder than I expected. Because they were true. My mother's expression tightened. So you just let us believe? Believe what? The room stayed silent. I looked around. What exactly did I let you believe? Nobody answered. I never lied. I never hid anything. I just stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. For the first time all evening, my father spoke. How long? A few years. The look on his face wasn't anger. It was regret. The party continued, but something had changed. People still congratulated Dad. Conversations resumed, but the atmosphere never fully recovered. Everyone had just witnessed a misunderstanding that had lasted more than a decade. My mother barely spoke to me afterward. Whenever she did, she sounded defensive, like she thought I had set the whole thing up. I hadn't. If I could have chosen, none of it would have happened publicly. My father was different, quiet, thoughtful, like he was replaying old conversations in his head. A few days later, my assistant called. There's someone here asking to see you. Who? Richard Hayes. Dad. A few minutes later, he was sitting across from me in my office. For a while, neither of us said much. He simply looked around, taking everything in. Finally, he exhaled. I owe you an apology. I stayed quiet. I spent years thinking I understood what success was supposed to look like. He laughed softly. A steady job. Safe decisions. Predictable outcomes. That sounds like you. It does. For the first time that day, he smiled. Then his expression softened. I kept waiting for you to come back to the path I understood. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he looked around my office again, at the life I had built without his approval, and quietly said, I thought I knew what success was supposed to look like. His eyes met mine. Turns out I was just too busy looking in the wrong direction. I nodded. That didn't erase 11 years. It didn't fix everything overnight. My mother and I still had difficult conversations ahead of us. Some hurt remained, some awkwardness remained. That's real life. But for the first time in years, my father and I were talking without assumptions between us. And honestly, that was enough. Sometimes people decide who you are long before they understand what you're actually building, and once that picture settles in their minds, changing it can feel almost impossible. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stop arguing, keep moving forward, and let time reveal what words never could. If this story connected with you, share your experience in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who thought they knew you best? And if you enjoy stories about family, perseverance, and unexpected moments like this, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next story. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.